John? John?
Oh, she's
We need, okay.
Are you giving us a red card? Do we have to leave now?
Thank you very much. Please do enjoy your lunch. We shall be joined shortly by our first speaker from London, England. And I mentioned at the beginning the conviction of Cafe that there is not a tug of war, there is not a shortage of compassion. It is not necessary to take it from one gender to give it to the other. We will be joined shortly by Erin Pizzey, and it is fascinating as well as very gratifying that she'll be speaking to us, because she is pretty much the pioneering founder of the whole movement for shelters for victims of domestic violence. And from the beginning, she has maintained that the cause of interfamilial violence is not gender, but that it is something that is passed down through the generations. That it is not something that is the fault of men, and that men are not the villains in this, and that men are sometimes perpetrators, but they are also sometimes victims. And that, as in so many things, we are all in this together. I don't know if you know, Henry Kissinger many years ago said that there would never be a victory in the war between the sexes because there was too much fraternizing with the enemy. But, of course, the more important message is that we are not enemies, that we are all fallible humans, we are all struggling together with all kinds of things, including this horrendous issue of domestic violence. And so in, I think, roughly 5 minutes, Erin will be joining us. Enormous credibility, having founded women's shelters, and then had some very interesting experiences when she decided that men needed them too, and she will be sharing these and other thoughts with us. Again, thank you so much for being here.
1971. One of the main things I was concerned about is that you had to, if you went to the doctor for contraceptives, you had to take your marriage, proof of marriage, before you were allowed to have contraception, and various other very small items. But I went in this great hope that we were told that sisterhood would mean that women would not cooperate or cause conflict with each other or compete, but would actually gather together to make the world a better place for all of us, particularly women with young children like me, who were lonely and isolated in our houses. But it took me only a couple of meetings in these huge collectives to hear that marriage was not a safe place for women and children, that marriage had to go, and that the most important thing that we could all do is to boot fathers out of families. And it was so extreme that most of us thought it was a joke. But of course, it wasn't a joke at all. But by the time I got kicked out of the women's movement, I went off to start what I've just told you about, a small community centre for mothers and children who were on their own and had talents that we could all use if we could have a place to be, which is what we had. Now, almost immediately, Kathy came in. She's the first woman in the world to come into the first purpose-created refuge, because once she came in, it was like an avalanche. There'd never been anywhere, actually anywhere in the world, that would allow women to bring their children and leave their homes. So as far as I was concerned, and from the very beginning, because you have to remember both my parents were violent. My mother was a great deal more violent to me than my father. Physically, she beat me very badly on many occasions. So I knew from the very beginning that this was a human condition. It was an intergenerational family condition. And that's one of the reasons why, with the first 100 women, I filled in questionnaires with them. And one of the questions I asked was, tell me as much as you know about your great-grandparents, your grandparents, and your family now. And I'm not the slightest bit surprised to find that, like me, the majority of them could chase violence right the way down the generations. Certainly in my family, we had alcoholics both sides. My mother, it becomes utterly understandable why she was as she was, a very frightening narcissistic exhibitionist. Because her mother died in childbirth, used and hated her. So she wasn't able to transcend the family damage. And that was my motive for opening the refuge. I knew from the first 100 women that I took in, 62 of them were as violent or more violent than the men they left. So as far as I was concerned, I needed to help those women to learn different strategies for survival. Yes, there were women who came in who were completely innocent victims of their partner's violence, as there are men. But those are not the majority. The majority, both sides, are coming from the generational violence. My problem was that I'd established my work, the understanding was there from the people who came to visit us and our research. But what I hadn't banked on, the gender feminist movement, was looking for funding, and they were also looking for a just cause because they'd run out of steam. They weren't offering women anything, and the women were leaving in droves. And so it fell into their lap. And in 1974, they managed to convince the British civil servants, who were only most willing to be convinced that their cause, the gender war, which then they perpetrated against men, was a just cause, without any evidence. But with that you have to remember, if those of you who are in the audience who are in their 80s like me, that there was this huge climate, particularly in Canada, thanks to Trudeau, of left-wing Marxist beliefs. And Marx had always said, and Engels, including the whole of that era of communism, that the family, in order to actually hand everything over to the state, the first thing must go is you must disentangle men from their loved ones. And from then onwards, it was a hopeless battle, really. I was asked to go to America shortly afterwards to help them start their refuges. And it was a dilemma because I knew what I was saying to be true. And I was met, as you can imagine, with an enormously frosty reception from everybody, particularly Leonora Walker from Colorado, who is one of the kingpins in the domestic violence movement. And I had explained to her, and I was there to help them open the first refuge. But it didn't get me anywhere. I was then given a lunch of honor on Capitol Hill by Lindy Boggs and Newton Steer. But from the moment I opened my mouth at the luncheon, you can imagine there was a disapproving, icy silence. And that silence followed me all around America. I then came back to England and decided that all I could do was to continue with my program for violence-prone women. And almost immediately, I tried to open a refuge for men because they needed refuge just as much as women. So I got a beautiful house given to me for a peppercorn rent from the British government. But when I went cap in hand to all the people who were more than willing to support women and children, nobody would give me a penny to support men. And this has been one of the major problems of the entire history of domestic violence, where men will give their lives to protect their wives and their children, but men will not give their lives in order to protect men unless it's a case of war. So I soldiered on, battling. I suffered terrible violence. I was hooted at and jeered at and picketed and screamed at. I wrote a book called Prone to Violence, which is my therapeutic programs for violence-prone people, which included the women in my refuge. It was only on the shelves for a few weeks and then it was pulled. But in order to publicize that book, I had to have a police escort all around England because of threats. And you don't get a police escort unless the threats are very violent. So I am so pleased to see you here today, because for me, to see men and women sitting together and discussing the needs for families, that's the whole point of this. Because during the 12 years I ran the refuge, I changed the name, the original name, from Women's Aid, which was for a community, to Chiswick Family Rescue, because it's the family we have to rescue. It's the family that we have to put back in place, and it's fathers that we have to install back in family life in their rightful role, protectors of their partners and children. So it's a long, hard road, but to see all of you today gives me great happiness and great hope. So now I think it's time for you to ask me questions. Gosh, I wish I was there. You're having a delicious lunch.
Can you see yourself being given a job as a gender consultant at a media station or a post-secondary school like a university or college? And if you, and if so, why? And if not, why not?
Why not? Because nobody except gender feminists are going to get any jobs anywhere in academia. The women who most need the help are violent themselves and violent to their children. They can't get into refuges. They're exiled. They don't take alcoholics. They don't take drug addicts. They don't take women who are violent, and they ages of 9 or 12. Why Canada is probably one of the worst places in terms of, to be honest with you, it's a hate group, the gender feminist group against men, is because Trudeau in those early days, and Senator Ann Cools and I, who are great friends, have discussed this so many times, he pumped enormous amounts of money into the emerging women's movement in Canada for votes. It's completely cynical. So they had a head start on every other country in the Western world, and probably are the most dug in. Now, I can see Dave over there because I can see his hat. Now, when I was in Canada, he and I talked a lot about this, and you now got Trudeau in charge again. This question of gender feminism, it's a political question. They are not going to let go because the money in this is enormous. The money that is handed over to refugees across the Western world are billions. So it's a gold-plated industry for women because it ring fences that, and only women can actually take those jobs. So you are now infested right the way through your society, right the way through your civil services, right the way through judiciary. Academic institutions are all now virtually feminist strongholds. And it's an enormous battle you've got ahead against you. But the more you understand the political implications, the better. I think the closest I can see it is the movement towards actually getting yourselves heard in the Senate, in the government. I don't think that one of the things that bothers me is where you get endless amounts of men talking about how many men are violent, how many women are violent. That's going nowhere. We all know it's not a gender issue. It's a political issue. And I don't know how many of you have seen my website, which is called www.honest-ribbon.org. On there is all the evidence, the academic evidence that anybody would need to recognize what has been a huge fraudulent movement. It is fraudulent for the money that has been gathered, which is supposedly go to refugees, doesn't go to the refugees. It goes to the women's movement, and it has funded it for nearly 50 years.
For the question, and thank you for explaining. I have recently experienced kind of a discrimination in the school district board and also on the Children Aid Society. But I was able to sort out one. I would say, I will read you the recent email I received on the 13th of September. It says, "Hi again. Just want to make sure everyone understands that this dad," so the superintendent of the school doesn't refer to my first name, no last name, "this dad," of course I believe she has a husband or father, "this dad is not the custodial parent. He has been known to tape people secretly in the past. I never had done, I don't do it." Yes, my question is, he wants to, I just want to read this one and ask, he wants his son to go to all of March, but mom lives in the Glencairn area and mom is happy with Glencairn. At the end of June, this dad tried to say his son was being bullied at John Young by students that would going to Glencairn. So his son should go to Earl of March. When his son was interviewed, he totally discounted the bullying. He said he had always treated kindly at John Young. Roger Mills was very familiar with this parent, Bess Susan. So what my question, there is no truth. This is the superintendent of the Ottawa Carleton School Board replying to my question about a principal who has done something incorrect information. So how do we?
I want to just say this to you. I absolutely understand what you're saying, and I'm not in the slightest surprise at her reply, and neither should you be. You have to understand that it is one of the problems with men is men will use men. It's an irrational movement. What you have to keep thinking about is all these superintendents who are working in all your school systems, even if they totally disagree with gender feminism, they wouldn't dare say so. They'd lose their jobs. So what it means is you have a huge amount of millions of women in Canada who understand the system only too well, who know how to use it and can use it against the fathers of their children, which is what they do. So I'm now asking you in Canada to think through the political implications of how you can actually tackle this hugely fraudulent movement, because they are not going to let go of the money or their power. They have both now, and they're certainly not going to at any point allow men to share any of that golden goose. Thank you. Goodbye, and God bless you all. Bye-bye.